but there are certain sites that are quite delicate in Iceland. And I mean delicate because the nature itself is very fragile and there's no infrastructure really in place to protect it. And if people who don't realize that go to those sites, they could really cause irreparable damage. So these are like certain places that I don't photograph and I don't share. And it's not because I'm trying to protect it for myself, but I'm just acknowledging that our influence on social media can sometimes have like very negative consequences. And more broadly speaking, I think that the ideas that we perpetuate online about like desire and romanticism, that they do have a greater effect on a large population of people, and we need to be sort of careful about what we're saying when we post images like that or share images like that.
I'm usually not without words, but that was I think what you just said there is pretty profound. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Patrick. Nice to be here.
Well, just so we start off really quick, just tell our audience a little bit about who you are, how you got started making work, and we'll just kick it over to you.
Okay, well, I'm an artist, an image-based artist working mostly in photography, but also in video and filmmaking. And I am originally from Canada. So I grew up in Canada and I studied photography there. And the first half of my career, I was working mostly in Canada and also doing some traveling abroad. But more recently, I've been based in Seydisfjördur, Iceland. That's been for about the last 7 years. I have a studio there, and then I've been working between the two places. So as an educator, I'm teaching in Montreal. And as an artist, I'm making work in Iceland. And for the past 7 years, I've been more preoccupied with Icelandic-based topics. And my work tends to be mostly like research-based. So I look at specific places, communities. The work is really rooted in a tradition of landscape. And then I sort of investigate the idea or identity of these places and how they're affected by the way people live there or the way people visit sites or just the way we think about landscapes or nature or historical sites in general. So that's kind of like broadly describes what I'm trying to do with my photographic work and my video work.
I think it's really, really cool. You also use a large format camera too. Is that primarily what you use?
So the camera itself, I think most people will be familiar with the type of camera because you've seen it. Maybe if you're not into photography, you might have seen it in films and so on. It's like, early 19th century photography was all made using this type of camera where you look through the back, you're looking through a ground glass, and the photographer puts their head under a dark cloth in order to compose and focus the image. So all of that is still part of my process, except I'm using color negative film. So it's not slide film. When I develop it, I have a negative image, and then I need to turn it into a positive through the print medium. Early on in my career, I was doing everything in the darkroom still. So I was having my negatives processed, and then I would print the work myself in a color darkroom using color processor and color chemicals. And I did that up until about 2009. But nowadays, it's much more convenient and much more consistent to move to the digital process. So the final prints that I make go through a process that is like negative scanning and printing using digital printers. However, I'm still printing on traditional photo paper, so color C prints. So the final result actually looks like a photograph. like a photograph that we would be familiar with, like in the 90s, for example.
Yeah.
The thing is, it's just gone through this digital process. As for why, but like,
go ahead. Yeah.
yeah. As for why would I use this camera or do this like multi-step kind of like slow and laborious process? I really like the quality that you get from shooting from a larger negative. So it allows me to make bigger prints. But it still retains a filmic look. And part of that filmic look is, we see the grain as opposed to an image that is very smooth or made up of pixels. And the colors that you get out of color film are very different from the type of colors that you get from digital imaging nowadays. You could try and replicate it, but I prefer just to use the natural colors that tend to come out of these different brands of film that are still available.
I really like the analog process, especially when you start doing large format style of photography. And the reason I was asking you to kind of talk about that process a little bit is that when you do a process like that, it really affects you as an image maker. And so talk to me a little bit about, you had mentioned in a previous interview a little bit about this, the reason why large format photography is important to you, how it slows you down. Can you talk to me a little bit about that process and talked about how it affects you?
Yeah, this is part of the why as well. Like, why would I still use this kind of technology? That it just requires a lot of extra time and commitment and labor, and that's because I enjoy the slowness of the process. So one of the reasons why it is slow is because we're not shooting like a roll of film or a card where you can just click the shutter really quickly. Every time you take a picture, you have like this process of thinking about where to set up the camera, because you're always using a tripod. So where do you put down the camera? Then you carefully compose, and that's partly because you want to make a great, a nicely balanced or harmonious image, but also because it's very costly, right? So you're not going to take 2 or 3 variations. You just want to get it right in the first place. And all this process is something that, like, I was trained to do because I went to photo school in the 90s when everything was still analog and the world was a little bit slower. But I kept with it because I feel that everything else in my life like has to be done like so quickly. It's just about keeping up, with your work life, your daily life, and so on, that I can only really sink into this slow, or you might want to call it like meditative, or just like a thinking space, the same kind of thinking space that maybe you would get from going on like a long walk, for example.
Yeah.
So going out to take pictures, to capture images, for me is a bit like going on that long walk where you get into a rhythm and your body just starts working on its own, and your mind is going into interesting places. So it becomes as much of a thinking process than it is like a making process, I would say. And that's just that's just a process that suits me, suits me as a photographer. And I'm not going to claim that I'm one of those people who always like takes their time or is like a big long thinker, or that I meditate on a daily basis, because like I just don't have the time for that. But I will definitely take the time when it comes to working with the camera and pursuing a project, because that's my space to do that, to take that time.
You could say, meditation takes many forms. And so you could say you are, because some people say they get into a certain flow state when they're making work or making art or photographing. Right. So you kind of are experience
I mean, it's
per se,
It's meditative, but it's not like my primary goal when I'm out taking pictures. I'm not saying, okay, I'm going out to meditate now. No, I'm really I'm after something else. And I like how the meditative process is going to affect the outcome of the photographs that I capture. Yeah.
So I think that is really important to highlight because it shows up in your work, and you can kind of tell you're really thinking about something, and you're spending time not just with your camera but in the space, like your presence in the environment wherever you are. You can feel you're immersed in it. Even the way you print your images sometimes and put them up in galleries or in shows. Sometimes you have a very large, very immersive print, and I think that speaks to your process in some ways. I shoot on a medium format camera, and I shoot on a little Hasselblad that I have to, look through the top. And the reason I do it is because I only get 12 shots, and I take one roll with me, and it slows me down. When you only have that many, you really think about what it is that, number one, you want to photograph, but you're also not just taking shots to take shots. I read an article recently that was about a gentleman who was in the United States Congress, and he was photographing in the press corps, and he was standing right in the middle, and he was shooting a large format camera, one of those old Graflex.
Right.
And he was taking it, I forget his name is Dave. I'll get it to you guys later. Maybe put it in the comments if you know who I'm talking about. But he was taking images, and he got maybe like 15 images where everyone else had the same digital kit around them. They had probably got 10,000 images. I'm probably exaggerating here, but thousands of images compared to his like 20. And there's something about that, I think, that is magical. And so if you would like, I would love to see the results of your walking. We're going to call it meditations. I'm just kidding. But let's take a look at some of those results. I would love to see some of your early work. You really went through an evolution from your time in Canada, coming to Iceland. Talk to me about that little journey. Maybe we can cut to some images right now and kind of take a look at some of those, and we can start there. What do you think?
Right. So, so would you like to look at some of my early work to start?
Let's go. Yeah. I think it's great. Yeah. And what's important here is you use images in such an interesting way. And I kind of want to know why you took the image, why you framed it the way you did, what you were thinking about. And then I have some other questions after that, which are a little bit more pointed. So go ahead.
All right. And I also want to preface the image looking part that not all my images are exclusively made using like a 4x5 large format camera.
Okay.
I also shoot with medium format because sometimes I'm, after something and I know that it's going to happen quickly and I don't have the kind of time. Or sometimes I back up something that I've shot on 4x5. I back it up with a image from medium format. And when I get to the stage where I'm selecting images, sometimes I like that one better. So this is part of early work. It's from a project called Re-Creational Spaces. And I actually did this project as part of my MFA thesis work. And it was, so we're talking about, like, I went to photo school 20 years ago. And so my career is already getting to be, 2 decades long. So this is a few decades old. And this work was presented as part of my MFA thesis when I graduated from Concordia University in Montreal. And, as part of thesis-based work, you're encouraged to do some research. And I started doing some research on iconic touristic destinations and why people were attracted by these places and how these places are transformed by tourism. So transformed from their original purpose or from their natural state towards becoming more of a cultural site or a cultural destination. So we're looking at Niagara Falls because that was one of the first sites that I decided to like visit, research, and think about. And I would go there, of course, with with my camera, because taking pictures, of course, is part of that research process.
Hold on one
And
second.
I
Heard you
took
drop a
many
little bit.
photographs of Niagara Falls, and I wondered maybe I would do a project exclusively on this site. But it ended up being a project about touristic destinations, iconic ones that people would be familiar with either because they've traveled there or because they've seen it in the media. So I realize it's also a visual culture show. So I'm thinking as well about the memories that people have because they've seen images either online or through advertising. So most people know about Niagara Falls, for example. And I also photographed in Las Vegas in the United States. And I expanded the project eventually to cover sites across North and South America. So a third example would be Machu Picchu in Peru, where I traveled to and I hiked to from the main departure point. If you're going like on a trek, would be from Cusco. So this is a place where you could visit quickly, like in one day on a tour, or you could hike there and like learn more about it. And that was like one of my goals. And walking, as I already kind of mentioned, is a big part of my process because it gives you more time to process the things that you're seeing and learning about. In terms of a visual approach, I think you can see just from the 3 images that I have a certain way of looking at landscape and making photographs, which is I move backwards, like from the scene, to get a larger view, like a larger perspective on a space. I like how different shapes in the images, for example. Patrick, can you see the picture of Machu Picchu in the slide right now?
Yeah,
okay.
It's there.
So we see how like it's a mountainous landscape, and that itself creates like some structure and composition to the image. In the case of Las Vegas, it's not so much the natural landscape, but it's the architectural landscape that's creating the composition. But when you look into the image, there are many other details, and actually I would call them even little stories, where you can find human figures, you can see what they're doing or what they're looking at or how they're engaging with these spaces, or simply understanding that scale is important, how we as humans are so small compared to the world that we live in. And I often take a little bit of an elevated view so that I can capture more of these details within a single frame. That has, however, changed over time, as this was to say like the approach that I took in my earlier works.
So when I look at these, I'm noticing the amount of details that you're able to bring into a single frame. And I have a quick question for you. In this, were you thinking about the audience when you were doing this, or was this more about doing a visual research for yourself?
Yeah, I think it's always both. It's at least it's always been both, because I went to photo school, and I always knew, I was going to show these to somebody. It was never audiencelessness. It was always intended to share with somebody. So, I mean, I'm using my own instinct as a photographer to choose what I'm going to photograph and how I'm going to photograph it. I mean, that's the starting point. But when you start like looking at your work and reflecting which images that you're going to actually print and show people, then you start to think a little bit more about the audience.
So when you look at this and you reflect on that time, what did you want people to feel when they looked at this image? What was your intent?
Well, with every image is different, but since we're looking at Niagara Falls, one of the interests I had in this particular place was that it's a site of like great natural beauty. And that's because of the scale of the waterfall there. And the natural surroundings at one point were, of course, it was like totally wild. So I tried to imagine being the first person to ever, lay eyes on this. And I'm thinking back, like, who knows who that first person was? It was like thousands and thousands of years ago, how they might have perceived that space. But I also want to bring the viewer into the contemporary world. So I kind of hint at that. I hint at the idea of the sublime, which we would maybe experience in a place that is truly, truly wild. But nowadays, I mean, this site in particular has been like fully developed. There are cities on both sides of the waterfall, that we have these large architectural structures. And furthermore, there's like a carnivalesque atmosphere to Niagara Falls. So we do see that in my image, but I just push it a little bit further into the background, and then I blow it up to make those details a little bit more visible. So I'm really talking sort of about the dichotomy or the paradox between the site as it was before people, before tourism, before development, and the site as it is today.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's, you can kind of see that in the next image with Las Vegas, because if you were to think about Las Vegas, it's just this, it shouldn't be there, considering
exactly
Nevada, it's literally a man-made paradise where they actually, they bring grass in to die, in it, because it doesn't live there. And so it's a fascinating dichotomy that you're bringing there. And it's funny, you talk about Niagara Falls, there's two sides of that city. You have the American side and then the Canada side. And on the Canada side, it does feel very carnivalesque. There's a wax museum and everything. I think I stood next to the wax Jim Carrey, while I was there.
Exactly. And it's a honeymoon destination as well. Like we know that, right?
Yeah. And how many people, there's that one spot where I remember that view, particularly when you're there. It's on, that seems like it's the Canada side, but there's where you can look right over the waterfall, but so many people take pictures there. You could sit there and all day and watch all the people that are, taking different images. And I'm sure it hasn't changed much. You said this was really early. And so that was 20 years ago or so. I bet it was very similar. I wonder what it's like today, probably a selfie machine. So I think that's fascinating. When you talk about the Machu Picchu, it's a little bit more obscure, that's our impact from, a very early civilization. Were you looking at that in the same way?
Right. Well, all of these sites, they are colonial sites. And then, I mean, this is this important thing to think about when you're looking at North and South America, because these lands were settled, relatively recently by European settlers, and there were indigenous populations in all these locations that I photographed prior to the colonization of North and South America. And so in this image, I think that we think a little bit more about that, because Machu Picchu was like an Incan village, and it that area of South America had been colonized and actually brutalized to be able to take their resources. So resource extraction is actually a theme that comes up in my work often, whether it's gold or silver or wood or codfish. It's something that we see in some of my other projects. It's like hinting in the background. And this site had actually been like hidden so that those like early colonizers wouldn't find it. And then much later on, I can't remember now because the research is a little bit far back, but I think it was like in the 1920s or that an archaeological team finally discovered the site. Wow. And that's why it's so well preserved. It's a well-preserved Incan village. But what we see in this picture is not the original Incan village. We can call it best preserved or well preserved, but it is in essence like a theatrical set. It's been curated. It's been curated for historical display, and it's been curated for tourism. And it sells itself. Yeah, it sells itself on the notion that it is a spiritual site, that it is a site of indigenous culture. And the people going there, I mean, we buy this stuff. That's part of what makes the place interesting.
In an interview, you said that once. You said that in an interview. It's like a tourism selling culture. It's selling a different lifestyle. It's just interesting how you put it, and it seems like that's a common theme throughout your work, and it started back then, and so you've maintained this same kind of approach. I think it's really interesting. So continue. You were going to add something.
Yeah, that like not only culture, but also historical importance, like historical significance, and nature itself becomes a sellable commodity when it comes to tourism and when it comes to landscape experience. So these themes, as you mentioned when we brought up this image, you said, okay, it's not as obvious. This image is maybe more nuanced than the other two. I mean, I like that because I don't want to keep hitting people over the head with the same ideas, like, project after project after project. But for me, it's more about like building on these ideas over time. And if some people don't, connect with that thematic in the work, maybe the colonial history of Machu Picchu is not at the forefront, they might connect with something else in this picture. Maybe it's just about, how the figures are following each other up the flight of stairs. And it makes us think about how we experience places as a tourist, because most of us, at least in the Western world, are tourists at one point or another in our experience.
Of course, it's interesting. It's it calls for reflection, especially when you're well traveled and you start to move around. I think what I really enjoy is the respect that you're paying towards all the dimensions of some of these. Because like when you go and travel to some of these places, you see the glitz and the glamour, and that can be the only thing you pay attention to. But what I really appreciate is the step back. I really appreciate that, and I can see it. And so I'll let you take us to the next piece. I've done a little bit of research, but you had mentioned codfish, which reminds me of one of your projects. And I thought that was a wonderful project. That might be our next stop. What do you think?
Well, if you're thinking codfish, you might be thinking about some work that I did in Newfoundland. I did a project following recreational spaces. I did a project called Unmarked Sites. And I was looking at how the history of settlement in Newfoundland and Labrador, which is Canada's most easterly province and the closest to Europe. I was looking at how the traces of settlement, European settlement specifically, was visible on the landscape. And how tourism and history were very closely intertwined there, because the province markets itself on being significantly historic, but also very natural and beautiful. So the cod fishery is an important kind of issue in the background, because when the cod fishery collapsed, I think it's the 90s now, and commercial fishery had to be put on a moratorium, the livelihoods of many people in Atlantic Canada shifted, and they had to find something else to do, which is where tourism starts to come in, like jobs in either culture or in tourism. So even though for that series, I was looking more at like history, archaeological traces, closer to nature, these ideas of tourism were still in the background. But unfortunately, I don't have that work queued up, but I think that maybe we should jump to just straight to Iceland. If not, we could be here.
I love it.
for a few hours.
You see You see that evolution. It's because I think that one project that you were talking about, unmarked unmarked spaces, right? Okay. Sorry.
Unmarked sites. Yeah, unmarked
That's right.
sites.
Sorry, I apologize. It's in my notes here. I'm like trying to find them. Unmarked sites. What's interesting is there's this move from like this touristic kind of perspective where you start to really deepen your research and you start to kind of go in. And I loved that particular project because you were also reflecting on the influence of them being a fishing community, and you were noticing the signs and stuff. It still said, "In codfish we trust," and
Right.
you were still seeing the presence of a time past, its effects, how it's evolving, and you're paying really close attention to not only the landscape but also the people that were a part of it. And I thought that was interesting, and I feel like it leads right into where we're about to go. So I wanted to bring that one
Right.
up. So yeah.
Yeah. So that project, Unmarked Sites, it did. It was maybe the beginning of a journey, because when I was visiting Newfoundland, I learned a lot about Norse settlement history in North America. So most people would refer to that as like the Viking Age, and when the Vikings traveled across the North Atlantic to the New World. And through that project, I started to follow a thread where I was looking into saga age history. So sagas are stories about the Viking Age. They were not written during the Viking Age, but 300 years after. So they're, in a sense, a bit documentary storytelling. Like, they feature true people and real events, but because they were written so far after, they were more narrative or subjective, or the authorship of them was so subjective. So I started to go on this historical journey. I like literally followed in the footsteps of the Norse explorers who traveled from the heart of Scandinavian countries like Denmark, Sweden, Norway, across the Atlantic, so through Iceland, through Greenland, and then back to Newfoundland. That project, or that body of work, took me over 5 years. And during that process, I was traveling to different Scandinavian countries, and one of them included Iceland. So I had actually, it was like a research fellowship where I was visiting museums and archaeological sites under the premise that I would photograph the archaeological sites, and that was part of the creative work.
Wow.
And while I was,
we have it queued up here too, right? Let me go ahead.
Yes. Let me make my way to this photo. So
okay.
the image that we are seeing on the screen. Okay, this was taken in Iceland in 2013, and I photographed this on one of my research trips when I was focusing on the Saga Age. This photo was not part of that project. It was like, we could call it a snapshot. I took it on medium format film when I went on like a tour of an island, and I was there to sort of learn about the history of that place. And because it was a touristic tour, I also got to see puffins, and that was the point for most people, is to go bird watching. And this one image sort of re-sparked my interest in tourism, that the topics that I was looking at earlier, when, for example, when we're talking about recreational spaces, and also thinking about how Iceland, or the North, had become a new frontier for tourism. During the years that I was traveling there, so it began in 2011, and then this photo was taken in 2013, Iceland had been placed on the map. So people had heard about it because there was this massive eruption that happened with a volcano whose name nobody could pronounce. It disrupted air traffic, so it made it into international news. And there was a banking crisis in 2008. So there were all these different social or political factors or historical events that led to the tourism boom in Iceland. And I decided to go back to Iceland to start to investigate that more specifically. And I did that in the context of artist residencies. So artist residencies are an opportunity where you can like live and work in another place. That's, it's not your home. It's not in your own studio. And you can spend more time and more focus on the particular thing that you want to learn about or you want to work on. And this is essentially how I ended up living in Iceland. It wasn't like a decision where I thought, okay, I'm just going to relocate. But it was after a few trips there and then 3 artist residencies of 1 month, old fish factory came up for sale, like a decommissioned herring era factory. So a building that had been built in the 60s and was no longer being used for that purpose. It came up for sale, and my partner and I, we had the opportunity to purchase it. And since 2016, since the time that we took over this building, I have been mostly based in Iceland and working on a series or body of work, many projects that look at the tourism boom in Iceland.
It's fascinating. It's I love that how you got there. Residencies are a great way, but what made you fall in love with Iceland? What made you like? I know you're doing photography, you're doing the research, you're following the saga. Why stay?
Mm-hmm. In Iceland, I felt close to the landscape because I've always been, as a Canadian, someone that went out into nature. I'm not saying that all Canadians do that, but we are in a country that has huge amounts of wilderness. And since I was young, I was always somebody who was attracted to that. And I found that in Iceland. I found that wilderness, let's not say wilderness, but we can say vast natural spaces. I found those to be very accessible, and I'm also more or less used to the climate. So the climate in Iceland is usually not something that people run towards. It's quite cold, it's very windy, it's very dark in winter and so on, but it's definitely not something that bothers me. I feel comfortable there. And in the particular community where I live, it's a small town called Seydisfjördur. It's in the east coast of Iceland. It's a very artistic town. Many artists live there, and it's seen as a cultural hotspot. And so I found a community there as well. So it's not just about the landscape, but it's also about feeling a sense of belonging or finding an environment or a milieu that you can connect with. So all those things kind of came together. Another factor is always personal. My partner is not Canadian. He's from Europe. And so it actually was quite convenient for us to find a home in Iceland, which is in between Europe and Canada. And he had also been living there for a few years previous. So both of us had an affinity for this place and felt comfortable to make a life there.
Let's keep diving into this. I love this image. It's I see your reflection on tourism in this image, because there's this beautiful waterfall, and then all of a sudden you see these little line of what looks like hundreds of tourists that are snaking into it, all trying to get a view or a shot for themselves. It's fascinating.
Yeah, so this is what I was looking at the beginning of this project. Like earlier in the project, I was traveling to particular sightseeing destinations, like I had with recreational spaces. But this time, however, I was focusing more on the human impact. There is not a lot of infrastructure in Iceland the way that we have in North America. We don't have, when I say we, I'm referring to us in Iceland. We don't have, we don't have like big, like divided highways or like We do have a lot of hotels now because of the tourism boom, but there aren't a lot of places or buildings at most of the tourist sites with that kind of infrastructure. So I was focusing less on the architecture and more on the human presence, like the human figure within the space. And over the course of several years, here I'll try to move to the next image. We should see two figures now. So these are two backpackers. Patrick, is that what you
I do,
see on
yeah.
your screen? Yeah. So during my process of photographing these places, I would start to encounter people and have conversations with them. Often it was me approaching them to ask questions about how they relate to the place or why they came to Iceland and so on. Sometimes people approach me because of the camera I'm using. So I'm definitely not inconspicuous as a photographer. I have this large camera that's on a tripod. And when I'm shooting, a lot of people are curious about, what exactly I'm doing. Am I making a photograph? And they ask a few questions about how it works. So this project led to a lot of conversations with tourists, with people who work in the tourism industry, and so on. So it slowly evolved to include like portraiture. So and these are all what I would call mostly encounters with people. This image is taken in the town where I live. It's a bus that comes from Europe. So on the bus itself, it says hotelbus.pl. And it's because there actually is not a lot of accommodation in Iceland. So sometimes these buses are imported on the ferry along with the tourists, and then they travel around the country and they sleep in their own transportation. So I'm documenting the phenomenon in some way. I'll cycle through a few images so you understand kind of the scope of the project and the different types of visuals that were included. Here we have...
still see that step back, that step back. I just...
Yes. Yeah, I'm employing that step back, but I also want to point out that I now avoid the elevated perspective. I've adopted what I call more of like the human point of view. So I'm staying grounded, at the same level as most other people. And I feel that this is a little bit more of a subjective way of looking at the topic rather than that objective observational approach that I was taking earlier in my work.
Yeah, it has a more personal feel to it for sure. Whereas the other one, that was a bird's eye view, almost like you're a helicopter checking it out, but now you're amongst it, and it's really nice.
Exactly. And then there's also this getting closer. So some images, they are pulled back. I called those more like the tableau-style photographs, where you have like an entire scene composed within the frame. But then there's some images that really get in tighter. So closer to that hotel bus and closer to the people that I'm meeting, towards more traditional form of portraiture. So in this image, we're seeing a portrait of a woman. She's sitting down. She's looking straight into the camera. Behind her, we see some kind of like school bus style, like a truck or a bus. It reminds us of a school bus, but it's not yellow, it's green. So there's some kind of hints here of like material culture, but we still don't know what's going on, where we are, who this person is. Are they tourists or are they somebody who works in the industry? So I'm combining all these different types of images and pictures of people to really just show what's involved in what's really happening in these spaces, who is involved, and also leaves some room to talk about the issues that we encounter when we have a phenomenon that involves mass tourism in more natural, wild, or unpopulated areas such as Iceland. This image, Patrick, it's of a cruise ship. And this is also taken in the town where I live in Seydisfjördur. The population there is 685 people, and it is a port community, which means we have like a deep sea harbor where large boats can enter. And historically, this has been an important ferry route. It's also a shipping route. It was significant during the fisheries, the cod era, the herring era. And nowadays, the port is mostly used to accommodate or to welcome cruise ships in the summertime. And this phenomenon had been rising continuously from the time that I purchased my own home there in 2016. And it hit its peak in 2019. And I think this photo might have been taken in 2018. So it's already kind of historically dated, because we know that in 2018, this massive ship came to Seydisfjördur. A ship like this can bring up to 5,000 visitors, like a ship of this size. So it really, puts into perspective the scale difference between the size of the town. We see that in the architecture, the local architecture that is inside the photograph. And we see that in relation to the size of the ship that's in the harbor. And we can also tell from this image, and it's almost a little bit awkward, that the ship almost looks like it's in the town. We almost don't see the sea, the body of water in which it's actually at birth in. So these issues, they're very close. I mean, they're in your face close. And there are some issues here about the invasion, so to speak, that happens when 5,000 people come to a small town with only 685 people, to welcome them, to host them, and create the space for them to have a day visit in a small Icelandic town. So
with that background,
right.
And what you just said, the tension that is in this image is palpable. It makes a lot of sense, and it's almost, you have these three structures, these three buildings in the foreground, and then right in the mid level there, mid ground, you have this huge ship that's almost a city all on its own. It's almost like they transported a city and dropped it right in the middle of this small town and said, "Well, go have at it." It's just it's an amazing view. It's interesting when you look back at this project, and you're talking about 2016, and how does it make you feel when you look at these images?
Well,
what are you trying to tell us?
There. Yeah, exactly. I mean, how it makes me feel is, I connect it, of course, to the memory of the experience. I'm not seeing this as an image, not just as an image, but as an experience that I had, over like several years. So just referring back to that time specifically, the tourism boom reached its peak in 2018, like between 2016 and 2019 in Iceland. But the cruise industry was at its highest in 2019. And then we had the pandemic. So for me, this is really about an era where something was like growing, mounting. For me, it was there was a tension there, of course. And I will also make the link in terms of my way of looking at these landscape issues. It has changed with my relocation to Iceland because it becomes a little bit more personal. With Niagara Falls, for example, I don't live there. It's me going somewhere else for a short period of time, observing something, documenting it, and then sharing the ideas I have about it with other people in the world. One of the reasons why I wanted to live abroad is I wanted to experience the places that I was interested in photographing over longer periods of time. I wanted to become closer to the project, or I wanted my daily life to be less separate from the work that I was carrying out as a photographer or as a video maker. So for me, this work is quite personal. So you asked me, what do I see in this image? I remember like my experience, and I reflect on my feelings. And I think about how the photographs now, post-pandemic, become like a marker of that time. Like they're already historic photographs. And I photographed many cruise ships during this period, and some of them were put into retirement during COVID, meaning they were recycled or they were simply, broken up and disposed of. And now that the tourism industry is starting to grow again, that it was larger or more numerous in terms of ships in 2023 post-pandemic than it was in 2019. So it's had its rebirth, or it's in a new era of resurgence. I see these images as like just important reminders of how things are happening in the world and how they're related to things that are happening around the same time.
I guess what I'm reflecting on is do you feel like this project led to your documentary Shore Power, which we're going to look at a little bit later? Do you feel like it was kind of a progression that you were kind of going through? It seems to be when I was looking at an interview you did as well, there's this idea of Disneyfication, which go ahead.
Yeah, I had used that word in an interview maybe 10 years ago. I'm not sure. But interesting to bring it back up now in the context of the cruise industry and its impact on small communities.
I think the way you use images in a way to talk about such a big idea, and you don't think about very often when you sign up for these cruises or do these tours or whatever, that you're almost commodifying the culture, its people, and all of that. And I think what you've done especially in that project, you gave us a chance to look at it from a different viewpoint. And I think you did it in a very respectful way. And I think it's done in a way that's not kitschy. You know what I mean? Not, what am I trying to say here? Slapstick in a way, insulting. It's just observation. It's taking a step back and noticing the scale of something and noticing its evolution. When you were doing this project, what did people say when they looked at this project? What did people feel when they would give you feedback? What were you hearing when you would get that?
Yeah, the feedback really depends on the audience, right?
Sure.
There is like when you have like a film like this, and it was presented, for example, like locally, like in my town's little cinema. It was premiered there, and then it was presented nationally, like so throughout Iceland, and then internationally through screening of photo festivals, and also integrated into some physical like exhibitions where it was continuously playing on a loop. The film did reach a diverse audience. But also we have to remember that this is like an art project, and it's not a mainstream documentary. It's never been on broadcast television. So it's never had like that mass audience, and therefore not really like a huge impact on affecting any kind of change, which was never my intention at all. But going into this project, I knew that it was going to be a controversial topic. Even though you might say that I've taken like a more objective position or method of recording the daily life during the cruise ship visits. Of course, all films like this, they have a subjective point of view. And I think that the point of view in this film is like quite obvious, that on a very basic level, that I, as the author, I'm seeing this phenomenon as a threat. And it's a potential threat to the community, and in terms of us becoming dependent on this kind of economy, or we're in danger of, if we go back to the idea of desertification, that the community is in danger of becoming a place that is no longer, what it used to be. And I'm not going to say like it's not going to be authentic anymore, but I'm going to say it's going towards an image that is constructed just to please outsiders, to make people want to come. And the whole reason for that, of course, is because of the economy. Tourism is an industry, and small countries and small communities often depend on tourism for nowadays for their basic survival. There are jobs at stake. And it's always a question of like this industry or that industry. So I think that because of the way I show the scale, and we see things happening in the film that makes us uncomfortable. An example of that is the voyeurism that happens when tourists come and they're looking at a subject. And I'm also using the camera to turn the gaze back on the visitors, on the ships themselves and the individuals. And that is also a little bit uncomfortable. People nowadays are just getting more and more uncomfortable with cameras, with the idea that the camera's rolling, it's recording, and it's going to be shown out there. So knowing that this was like a delicate topic and I had my own position on it, and knowing that many of the people that I live with, people in my town, have a very different perspective and they want to protect this industry, I went about it in like a careful way. But of course, there are many people who reacted to the project and saw the film itself as a threat on the survival of the community, or the role of the industry, or the amount of income that the harbor can generate for the town. But this is a lot of big issues kind of compressed into like a small discussion. On the other hand, there are a lot of people, mostly from the international world, and let's say like groups of other artists and photographers, who are like already totally on board with the point of view that I'm presenting in the film. And that the film isn't actually necessarily, it's not made for just people to say, yeah, okay, this might be problematic. I really want people, like, sorry, I'll back up and say it's not for people to point the finger and say this is definitely wrong. But I want people to think about how it's problematic and how can an issue like this be resolved, and how can a community find another way to replace this industry and still thrive. So there are many different layers and different reactions that the film can elicit from the different audiences. It kind of depends on how invested I think the viewer is in going deeper into the topic.
And it's something you don't. I think you did a really interesting job with it. It's we're going to cut to that trailer here in a second, and I thought who was the person doing the quote in your trailer? Who was it? Somebody that lived there? It was.
Yeah. So the voiceover, it was recorded during an interview, so it's unscripted. And the person speaking is an Icelandic guide who lives in Seydisfjördur now, but he's not originally from Seydisfjördur. He's from another area in Iceland, and he's been working as a guide for over 20 years. And if you watch the whole film, you'll understand that he's not actually talking about cruise ship industry specifically, but he's talking about tourism in Iceland more generally, or the idea of how it's changed over the last 20 years.
I think that's interesting. We're going to go to that here in a few minutes, but I have one question. It's it's subject matter. It's based on the subject. From your experience, having lived there, do you notice that the tourism industry has brought maybe economic immigration, where like new people are moving in just to take advantage of the boom? Have you noticed that new people are there that aren't necessarily, there may be first generation that are there? Is the population growing by this, and how do you think that affects it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the population of Iceland is growing, and mostly through the immigration process, and that group of people are mostly coming from within the EEA, because you can live in Iceland as a European with a passport from the EEA. And most of those people have come to Iceland because of the opportunity. So I'm not going to say the opportunity is completely limited to tourism jobs, but it definitely is playing a huge factor in the amount of people who are settling in Iceland.
I think it's a fascinating topic, and it's just it sounds like this could be really interesting research, because you're on a front seat. So what I'm going to do right now, we're going to continue this conversation, but I want to go ahead and pause for a moment so that we can check out the trailer. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, we're going to go ahead and play that now.
The common tourist that came to Iceland when I started guiding almost 30 years ago, compared to tourists coming to Iceland today, you can look at the difference in character between these two types of travelers or tourists as the difference between a person that acquires a piece of art for what it is, as opposed to someone that acquires a piece of art just so that they are able to hang it up on their wall, just to show that they did acquire it. We get a lot more people today who just want to be able to say, I was there, I did this, and here's my Instagram account to prove it. When that's your reason to go somewhere, it's about you completely. And local communities, they become props. Whereas the person who appreciates the work and the methods which were used to create that particular piece of art, they come here to experience the raw material. It's about experiencing the landscape and the locals as something they are a part of, but not as something that is just there in the background.
When you view that piece and his perspective of tourism in that quote, was very impactful on me. It's what I liked about your story is that you were talking about how you wanted to go somewhere but immerse yourself. So you kind of wanted to be there for a long amount of time so that you could, really experience a place. And in a lot of ways, what it seems like today, and it relates to my research in this podcast, is we're almost like traveling to places to collect experiences so that we can share them online. And he's kind of calling it out. He's in that quote. I would love your perspective on that and what you got from that. And why did you pick that quote, that particular soundbite for the trailer?
Well, it's a good question, because I find that what he's talking about in the trailer, of course, is just a few layers of the interesting issues that we're looking at in the film. But one of the first questions that I had about the tourism boom in Iceland is like the why. Why is this happening? And as I mentioned earlier, there were certain world events that contributed to the world giving their attention to this Nordic island that had not really been interesting or even anyone knew about before. And there's also its like kind of geographic position, like being in the North Atlantic and between North America and Europe. It was becoming more accessible by plane, for example. And then there was this the other thing that was happening with social media, of course. So the rise of Instagram. And one of the largest like lifestyle themes on Instagram is travel. And more specifically, I would say like adventure travel, because it really speaks to our desire to get away, to experience the exotic, to have an experience with the sublime, and so on. And so Iceland is one of those places that was attracting travel photographers, influencers, or just even the everyday tourist, right? The everyday tourist would post their pictures from their recent trip to Iceland, and they would get a lot of attention for it. And of course, that perpetuates popularity. So I haven't done like any solid research on this, on how social media has contributed to the mass tourism that we're seeing in Iceland, but I have a feeling that it's played like a really big role. And I have also... Yeah. Right. Yeah. And I've also thought, as an image maker myself, and someone who is sharing images of Iceland, I've thought about how delicate that can be. So, for example, I don't think that if I post images of Iceland on Instagram, I'm making a big difference to how many people are going to travel there. That's not the issue. But there are certain sites that are quite delicate in Iceland, and I mean delicate because the nature itself is very fragile, and there's no infrastructure really in place to protect it. And if people who don't realize that go to those sites, they could really cause irreparable damage. So these are like certain places that I don't photograph and I don't share. And it's not because I'm trying to protect it for myself, but I'm just acknowledging that our influence on social media can sometimes have like very negative consequences. And more broadly speaking, I think that the ideas that we perpetuate online about like desire and romanticism, that they do have a greater effect on a large population of people, and we need to be sort of careful about what we're saying when we post images like that or share images like that.
I'm usually not without words, but that was, I think what you just said there is pretty profound. As an image maker, I take images all the time, but sometimes I rarely think about the impact, because I'm collecting frames, and putting it in my camera and just doing me, and just like what you were saying, where you. Why I kind of highlighted your process with a large format camera, you're kind of just thinking and being in your space and being where your feet are. But to practice restraint, because you understand the impact of an image per se, especially in a social sphere, which can drive tourism, is an impact that I just think is just fascinating. What do you think today? And I don't want to get off the subject. You can add more if you want, but what do you think, like as an image maker today, what do you think is impacting us today as image makers? Are we being driven by these social media machines, or are we chasing our desires? You had hinted at. I thought that was wonderful. I just had a conversation with somebody earlier about that idea. What do you think is impacting us today? What do you think is driving image culture today, from your perspective, as an educator, as someone that makes and stuff like that?
Yeah, I've always found it very difficult to like analyze what's happening like right in the moment. You know, it's always easier to like look back. You know, so if you permit me to like look back a little bit, I mean, we've always as a society been influenced by the, you know, visual culture, whether that was, you know, whether that's been art or whether it's media in general, like advertising and so on. And, you know, nowadays we're talking more specifically about social media. And that's because it's extremely present, and it's also been, you know, programmed in such a way to maximize it, like visibility and participation and its influence. So we can talk about the algorithm and all those things, but I think that we are definitely being affected by this. I don't know what to say so specifically, but I do believe that it's leading to a lot of mental health issues.
Sure.
I think it's very closely related to the current issues with mental health. So you take the social media phenomenon, and then you take the pandemic and all the other conflicts that are happening in the world, and this is a really, you know, dangerous recipe for humanity. And I don't know what to think about it, and I definitely, you know, don't know, you know, where we're going or what the solution is. But I mean, just as an individual, I think, you know, for me, it is about, you know, thinking through things and practicing restraint. Yeah. You know, understanding the impact of something and making sure that you protect yourself from these boundaries, and you make sure that the things that your actions, so before we were talking about images, but I also think it's actions, you know, the action of sharing or the action of traveling, you know, understanding that has a greater impact on other people, like even way more than you can actually, you know, fathom.
So when you look back at your work and the way you use images, because you're using them in a way to share ideas, when people look at your current work, what do you want them to see? What do you want them to think about? Do you have that idea, or you want them to kind of come to their own conclusions? Are you trying to drive us into thought, or are you just trying to drive an idea? How are you using them?
I would say I'm leaning more towards driving people into thought. But as I think as an author or a storyteller, you know, you have to guide people. You have to take, you know, this is the effective way, is like you take them by the hand and you take them somewhere. You lead them through an experience. You don't need to use words, and I rarely do. Like, we're talking now about these issues deeply, but my voice is really through image making. And what I'm trying to do is take my audience like into a space on a journey and allowing them to process their thoughts, their thinking on the situation. And but that, of course, you know, I'm using strategies, you know, and my strategies are not like, of course, I don't think that they're manipulative. I think that it's really just thinking about, okay, you know, what some things in the world that are maybe going a bit sideways, that you get people to go in like a direction that you think is maybe a little bit more safe, a little bit more careful and thought out. and courteous of the planet and of other people. So I can put this into like an example, because my most recent body of work, it was called Landvörður in Icelandic, which translates to ranger, as in like park ranger. And for that project, I photographed park rangers across Iceland. So the creative part of that took place during the pandemic, because actually most of the tourists, were not around. It's not that they weren't there, but there were so few of them that it became easier to find the park rangers, or they were more visible and accessible. And I made a portrait project about them. And they became the leading line for thinking about our impact on the landscape. So it's very much connected to the theme of the tourism boom, but bringing us back to the land itself. So there are many photographs of the landscape. Of sometimes we see like the damage that has been caused in the landscape, and then these images of park rangers that were really about these people kind of like looking back at you, because they're very direct portraits. I can show an image.
I would love it. Yeah.
So they're looking directly into the camera, and in some way, they're also an authority. Just give me a moment to cue that up.
Of course.
So now you should see like a full body portrait, frontal portrait of a woman in a uniform with this vast empty landscape behind, although we do see, some mountains and some glacier in the distance. So the uniform tells us that this person has like some kind of authority. If you know a little bit more, you'll recognize that it's a park ranger uniform. But at the same time, the figure in the picture appears to be very humble, almost a little bit shy or vulnerable, because, the reality is that their photo's been taken. But when, and I'll show you a second version. So my portraits of rangers are typically like full body with the person looking directly into the lens. But then when presented in exhibition, these images are integrated with photographs similar to the ones we have seen when we looked at the Looking North project. So photographs of sites, photographs of tourists, and photographs of nature, that they almost become like the guardians of the exhibition space. And they're looking at, like, back at you as a viewer. And I think that makes people conscious of themselves, of their own role. And in the case of this exhibition, it was first presented at the Reykjavik Museum of Photography, which receives a lot of visitors over the course of a summer, which is when it was presented. And the majority of the visitors nowadays are tourists. So they're people who have come to Reykjavik either by plane or by cruise ship. So they're being confronted with the issue or the phenomenon that they're participating in. And the feedback that I got from this exhibition was actually, it was different than Shore Power, in the sense where a lot of people with the Shore Power film said, like, oh, I don't agree with your point of view. I think that you showed this phenomenon in an unfair way. With Landvörður, I didn't get a reaction like that. It could exist. I didn't get that type of feedback. I really got people, texting me via DM on Instagram, or when I was in the space, they would come up to me and they say, "Oh, are you the artist?" And I say, "Yeah." And they said, "Wow, your photos like really made me think." And they would say, "I feel a bit awkward now. I feel a bit awkward in the space, or I feel a bit awkward with my reason for being here." And I think that was a nice way for us to actually have a conversation and not have a confrontation over the issues of landscape preservation or over tourism or any of these complicated or more controversial subjects.
I think they're really powerful, and I love the size of it. And there's nothing like in my opinion, a large format portrait. They are something else, and they print so high def. It's almost like you're being confronted with the person.
Mm-hmm.
They're standing right there, and so I think the scale is wonderful. I will say. I like how you blend the landscape and a portrait together when you do the full body. It's I know rangers, and they take we have even some where I'm from. They work for the Army in the United States, where I was at least, and they took it as a responsibility that you have police that are to protect and serve the population and whatever property and other things. But the Rangers, they take a full responsibility to protect the nature that they're a part of. And they're there to monitor and protect the space. And so I bet they had unbelievable perspectives. Was there anything that in that project that you took away from it that you weren't thinking before you went into it?
Yeah, actually, of course, part of the idea was to have these conversations with the Rangers and understand, their thinking behind everything. And the interesting, again, this paradox, of for them, that if the tourism wasn't such a strong industry, they probably wouldn't have a job. But then their job is constantly chasing after the trash that's been left on the ground as litter, or repairing the tracks of off-road drivers, or photography comes back into as a picture as an issue here, because a lot of photographers are actually the biggest offenders of crossing into areas that they're not supposed to, because they want to get a better photo.
Yeah,
so
they want a different one. Yeah.
Different one. Yeah, different one. Or they want to make sure something's on the composition, or they don't want, another tourist in their picture. So photographers, they tend to cross these boundaries, and the Rangers' jobs are often, fishing these photographers out of places where they shouldn't be going. And so there's all these different paradoxes with their job. And it was really interesting to talk about that, the situation they're in. And of course, this just general paradox that I'm looking at, where I'm mostly focusing on, how can we protect, how can we protect natural environments, but also make them accessible? I think people should have the right to see places. You don't want to keep them private or only for a privileged few. But at the same time, how do we protect it from the masses? Where do you find that balance? And with tourism, it's always a constant struggle.
It's a tough question. And, I can tell you now, I of course I'm American and I live in Paris, so it's, I've definitely been a tourist in my time, but, finding that balance between respecting the place and the culture that exists there, it's a fine balance, and it's hard to kind of consider. Have you thought through that? Have you thought through what that balance might look like, or is it still one of those things you're trying to understand yourself? Yeah.
Of course, I'm still trying to understand. I've thought I've thought of, especially as a documentary filmmaker, I think that you get more into this mindset of finding some kind of resolve or solutions, such as quotas, for example. Let's put a quota on this space, but it never I've never seen to settle on the right thing to do, the thing that might work. It's I think that in photography or in art, when we're looking at problems we see the opposite of the problem as some, kind of perfect situation, like a utopia. And I'm aware
Sure.
that the utopias are really hard. Yeah, they're really hard to achieve. So I'm more interested in this gray area, or just the idea of people, instead of being told you can't cross that line, like we put a rope there, you can't cross it, that people are just more aware of what happens when they cross it. And they use their own judgment.
I have a great mentor that always tells me that the world could use a little bit more consciousness. You know what I mean? A little bit more like understanding of their impacts on things. And I think you do a really interesting. Yeah, there's the tracks in this image. That's
the tracks.
Yeah,
and I had asked the rangers.
Wow.
In terms of like collaborating with them, a lot of artists like to say, "Oh yeah, I'm collaborating with people," and it's like, yeah, okay. There's a fine line sometimes between like your subject and your collaborators, and the rangers were definitely, they were the main subject of this project, but they really added something to it, because I would ask them, okay, can you guide me through these issues? Can you tell me, where these problems are happening? So in the case of these tracks, I was guided to go there and photograph this place where off-road driving has left these terrible scars in the moss that will eventually recover in 4 or 5 decades. But it's still very unfair for the next generation of people to not be able to experience this place without these scars that don't have any, they don't have any positive value in this place. They're simply the act of somebody who was selfish.
Powerful stuff. It is powerful stuff, and I take particular offense that it's photographers that are doing it. I'm just kidding, because I am very much a photographer, and I love taking landscape images. And there you go. Yeah, what a great shot.
The whole point is to think about our own role, and as you as photographer or me as photographer, it's I think it's important to think about our own position, and recognize, nobody's perfect either.
Yeah.
Nobody's perfect. We all make mistakes. But I think it's important to understand the power that anybody wields in a certain position. And photographers do wield the power of representation. And that's something we should be aware of.
And that's what we're exploring in this show. This is what this is all about, is to take a look at these images. Number one, I love your perspective, and I love how you use images in a very contemplative, thoughtful way. You use your medium well, and it's you craft them so thoughtfully, and they're so immersive. It's one of my favorite. What I love about great photography, especially good photographers, is they create this great tension within their image. It's not just a landscape. There's something in there that is creating some type of tension, and to see those tire tracks and those scars in that beautiful landscape, you can't help but feel something. And so I'm quite taken by this series. I like it a lot. I like it a lot. And I really appreciate it. Is there anything else you would like to share in this series that we missed, or you would like to share in that? Because we're about to wrap up. I have one more question for you.
No, I think we can go ahead with your questions.
Okay. Well, one of this show is, I think we did a lot of it as we were going through this whole looking through all your series, looking at the progression, your evolution. Do you have any advice for people that are image makers today? I think we hinted at it a little bit in this last conversation we had a little bit. Do you have anything that image makers should be thinking about today? It's a good question. I got you.
I think there's infinite answers, and I'd give you a different answer, in an hour or tomorrow or the day
Consider
after.
the context.
It all, I think it all just comes back to like, as image makers or artists, like, don't think about like don't become preoccupied by what makes a good photo. Like that's often what, I get asked, like, oh, talk to us about what makes a great photo, or talking about like certain trends in the art world or in the photo milieu or anything like that. Like, I think it's just about like pursuing the thing that you're interested in.
Yeah.
And, I know that what a lot of people, when they, see my work and they take like a little bit more time to go through the different projects, they can see that I've been onto something. How important it is, I don't know, but the truth is like I'm obsessed with it because it comes from within.
It's general.
Nobody's asking me to do this.
Yeah.
It's a genuine preoccupation.
Yeah. And I think that's interesting. I got in this conversation about the long game with another person. We're in this, he's an art teacher, and he was talking about how everyone's just in this hurry to produce, get results. But one thing that I've noticed in your work is that you have this preoccupation, a genuine interest that is pulling you through. And that's what you would say is find that thread and pull it out and keep pulling.
Just listen to yourself. Listen to like you trust your instincts. Don't worry about what other people are doing. Like when I say like I think about my audience, I think about my audience like when I'm editing. I think about what my pictures are communicating to the audience, but I'm not making the work for them. I'm making the work because I can't help it. Like I can't help taking pictures. I can't help spending every day working with images in some way or another, or thinking about the ideas behind my project at the very least. And that I'm not doing for anybody else. Like,
that's awesome.
Obviously.
Who is,
it has to come from within. Yeah.
I often think about my visual lineage, and I often think about people that have influenced me. Do you have any artist or anybody that you look at that often influence you? Ansel Adams? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, well, if we want to talk about like traditional photography.
No, we don't have to, but the landscape.
Well,
he's like
it's fair. Yeah. I think it's good to talk about like in the context of a podcast on photography, that we talk about maybe people that are known, so like good reference points. So for me,
even unknown,
the Beckers, yeah, but I think like I always go back to the Beckers or the Beschers or however you say it, wherever you are in the world, because they were extremely committed to their work, and they were like obsessive collectors. They had incredible discipline. And so for me, I've seen them as like a guiding light in my work. And then of course there's an affinity with the subjects that they were pursuing. They were looking at mostly post-industrial architecture, set within this landscape context. So I feel close to their interests as well. And then in the world of filmmaking, I always go back to Werner Herzog. He's incredible storyteller, and also just I think the secret to his success has really been his creativity.
Yeah.
And he comes up with like interesting and creative ways of presenting documentary topics. He takes risks. Of course, now, now he can do anything. It doesn't really matter. He almost can't fail. But early on in his career, he took a lot of risks. And I think that as a maker, we can't worry too much about following what other people do or what we think, or what teachers tell you is the safe way to go, or you should do this and that. Just, you have to listen to yourself, and you have to take risks once in a while. So
he's also,
those would be the two.
One of the best voiceover people I think that exist.
Yeah.
Just his voice is something else.
If I had his voice, if I had his voice, I would be using it. But I don't have his voice, so I don't do the voiceover of my films. I just speak. I speak with my images. Is what I.
Yeah. I think that's wonderful. And so, I think we've had a wonderful conversation, and I'm so thankful that you took your time to join me from Iceland, and you joined me for this conversation. I really, really appreciate it. I just want to say thank you for your time and sharing your work, sharing your story, giving me insights, and it definitely, I think it enriched me, and I'm sure my audience as well. So I just want to say thank you very, very much for joining me today.
Well, yeah, thanks, Patrick, for the invitation, and also to anybody who is listening. Thank you.
Of course. And as usual, if you like and enjoy these conversations, please like, share, and comment, as well as to support our Patreon. That's how we actually support this project. So thank you so much for joining us on the Urbanaut. We'll see you next time.